You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 30th of June 2025 on Monocle Radio.
The 12-day war may be over. Attempts to understand it may take longer. Are laments for a bipartisan America really much more than delusional nostalgia? And is now quite the right time for a holiday in Lebanon? I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Burcu Özçelik and Layla Milana Allen will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the author Jill Kastner about her new book chronicling the history of great power subversion. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Burcu Özçelik, a Senior Research Fellow, Middle East Security at RUSI, and Layla Milana Allen, Monocle's Middle East Correspondent. Hello to you both.
Hi. Hello.
Layla, first of all, it's sort of useful to what we will be discussing later in the show. You have recently been to the United States.
I have just returned only a few hours ago on a slightly more painful red-eye than imagined, because temperatures were even worse there than here, and there were huge thunderstorms all over the East Coast, so we kept getting delayed and had to be rerouted through Canada, but very glad to have made it back just in time for the daily.
And a better than average chance of you falling asleep during it.
I would say 50-50. I think you probably got me 17 and a half minutes.
OK, well, we will try to pack as much into that as we possibly can. Burcu, possibly less germane to what we are shortly to discuss, you have recently been visiting Turkey, which is not to say it's not an interesting country in which loads of stuff happens, because it is. We're just not talking about it much tonight.
That's right. We're not. Although I can, if you'd like me to.
If you want to shoehorn references to Turkey in at any juncture, go right ahead. But
challenge accepted.
What were you in fact doing there?
I was working, conducting some research for a project that we're running at RUSI that looks at the idea of illiberal peace building in the Middle East and Turkish foreign policy making with respect to Syria and Iraq.
See, weirdly, however, illiberal peace building is something we will shortly be getting onto. But we will start by contemplating the picture of Iran's remaining nuclear capabilities emerging from the settling dust of what US President Donald Trump has attempted to brand the 12-day war. And for more on that, do tune in to the current edition of the Foreign Desk just as soon as you're done listening to this. Plausible reporting has it that the US is in receipt of intercepted communications between surviving senior Iranian officials, suggesting that the American strikes accomplished rather less than the complete and total obliteration declared by the president. For whatever it may be worth, US Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, previously a skeptic on Iran's nuclear intentions, is now suddenly all in on Trump's view of events. Burcu, first of all, do we think anybody anywhere actually knows for sure yet how much damage was done?
No one outside of Iran. And even then, I think it's quite a limited circle of experts who have actual access to this information. I think what's fascinating and also extremely frustrating is the level of disinformation around the reporting. Mm-hmm. And we've been told that it's premature, that the bomb damage assessment and satellite imagery that is available so far is an inadequate sort of barometer to assess the success of the U.S. strikes against Iran's 3 nuclear facilities. But what's fascinating is the spread of disinformation is part of a sort of a psychological campaign on all sides. The main parties to the conflict, the United States, Israel, and Iran, have been using social media and mainstream media as well to really sort of spread their own narratives of victory. This idea that each side won and are now celebrating their triumph. I think that is the what's emerged quite unusually, I think, out of this war. I mean, this is a long-standing tradition in military history in the different interpretations of what counts as victory and surrender or loss. But here, I think it's because of the pace of social media, the accessibility of it, it's really and of course, U.S. President Trump's turning to social media to announce ceasefires and various other milestones. I think it's been really interesting to watch. But of course, this campaign of psychological warfare is a tool in asymmetric warfare itself. And so now if we consider the prospect of diplomacy going back to talks, whether that happens and when that happens, I think one way to read these various interpretations of how much damage was actually achieved at the nuclear sites, one way to interpret this is how various sides are positioning themselves in terms of their bargaining postures, their negotiating tactics, and who has leverage over whom and to what extent.
Layla, this is probably an aspect of the psychological warfare, but is there an argument that it doesn't much matter, really, whether the United States hit anything? What is important is that they have demonstrated to Iran that we can come and go as we please and there's nothing you can do to stop us.
I don't actually think that's what's happened. I was, when we were waiting to see whether they would go ahead or not, there was great concern that this was kind of crossing the Rubicon, and much as Israel crossed the Rubicon, moving from these kind of occasional strikes and assassinations to suddenly launching all-out war. That was the tripwire that we wanted never to be tripped. Then America comes in. But the fact that they were so clear from the start that it was going to be an isolated one-off. The fact that when Iran responded, they warned the US in advance. Not only did they warn them so no one was hurt in the strike in Qatar, but also that Trump came out and thanked Iran for doing so, right? I mean, this was all actually pretty low level, kind of trying to calm the scene diplomacy. So it actually is pretty important what they've hit, because if this was a one-time deal and it was unsuccessful, that huge threat is no longer really a threat. Did they move some of the uranium? Did they move some of the centrifuges? Have they managed to get equipment out? How much was there in the first place? The fact that we can't answer all these questions that have been the whole game for decades, of whether or not the West should go to war in Iran, that's really the issue. And it's so interesting for me hearing Roger, talking about how, from the point of view of a defense research specialist, they're looking at this. Because for me, as a frontline journalist on the ground, the deep frustration here, of course, is that we go and we find out. Now, for the last 18 months, it's been the Israelis stopping us from going to Gaza and finding out what's actually happening. Now, of course, it's the Iranian regime stopping us from going, not just us entering the country. A couple of Western journalists have been allowed to do some incredibly superficial man-on-the-street journalism, but, of course, stopping Iranians from going as well. And in this case, there's such a media blackout in Iran that the impact has really been on the Iranian people. Something people aren't even speaking about is that it's completely illegal to hit nuclear sites like this, right? All these sites are near large population centres. The site near Isfahan, there are 2 million people living in Isfahan. If you hit enriched uranium and it leaks into the soil, that's devastating for the future of a country, right? And of course, another thing that the regime won't admit if it does happen, because that will then be seen as their inability to look after their people. But people in Iran, now having recovered from the terror of being bombed in their homes, and 600 people died in those 12 days, are now terrified that the government isn't telling them if the uranium has been hit and if the land and the water might be contaminated.
But do you get the sense yet that the Iranians have actually figured out what their response beyond that somewhat theatrical strike on the airbase in Qatar is going to be? Their UN ambassador Amir Iravani has been reiterating the line that Iran will never stop, as he put it, enriching uranium. But he also said, strangely, they're quite open to transferring such stocks as they have to some other country.
That's right. So the Iranian regime at the moment is playing with, I think, a menu of options in terms of what they could show to demonstrate their great frustration that their homeland was struck in violation of international law, in violation of their right to sovereignty. Iran's nuclear program is historically a source of great pride for the regime and arguably for the people as well, even though that sentiment is probably not as shared across all segments of the population. But the fact that these strikes took place, and bear in mind, we're focused, and for good reason, on the nuclear facilities, but there were also a number of other targets that were attacked, including senior commanders in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, in the IRGC, in the military, nuclear scientists, and civilians associated with family members of these individuals as well, and other kind of state or regime targets, such as the state media broadcaster. And so there was a kind of a holistic target deck that was attacked inside Iran. Now, in terms of the response from Tehran, it must be of a sufficient level of credibility and to warrant attention. Again, going back to the idea of bargaining positions and future negotiations. And the regime has said that they would halt any monitoring activity of IAEA. So the possibility of verification and monitoring is presumably off the table for the foreseeable future until Iran changes its mind or is compelled to do so. The looming threat of Iran possibly withdrawing from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, or at least triggering a withdrawal, which would take up to 3 months. And again, the big, I suppose, source of leverage and also concern for the international community is that Iran has had previously, before the attacks, anticipating the attacks, moved up to 400 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, up to 60%. And so they have shielded sufficient quantity of sensitive material as well as other centrifuges, etc. And that their ballistic missile program and armed drone program has also been safeguarded to a sufficient level. So from the Iranian perspective, the narrative or what's being shared to international media and counterparts is that they have survived to fight another day. That is this narrative of triumphalism that we're seeing emerge from Tehran at the moment.
And just to pick up on something that Brochi is saying, I think something really important that really isn't being covered, or the tone isn't in the media at all, because there's this idea that, Iran is the big ogre of the world, right? Is that throughout this, Iran has been the grown-up. We may not like Iran. We don't like the regime. They're responsible for absolute horrors against their people for many decades. But the reality is, the cognitive dissonance of hearing the Israeli ambassador to the UN saying that Iran is the greatest threat to the world right now, when Israel is responsible for, at the very least, 65,000 deaths in the region over the last 18 months, probably many more, while Iran conducts horrible acts against its own people, but very little in the outside world and certainly not beyond the region. And
they've conducted a fair bit of horrors across the region in recent years, though.
They certainly have. But in terms of this, in terms of the nuclear negotiations, in terms of the idea of them being the greatest ill in the world, when in fact they were trying to negotiate, they were willing to negotiate, then strikes happened against them. And now again, these new statements are coming out, that Iran is threatening IAEA inspectors. They're not threatening them. What they're saying is, we were in the middle of negotiations with you. You refused to come out and condemn these strikes from Israel that happened in the middle of negotiations. Now you're saying you want to send inspectors in. Why would we host you? Why would we believe you? Why would we trust you? And I think until, both the world and negotiators can take a step back and say that actually, if we're going to negotiate with these people, it needs to be in good faith. My great concern is that they're going to feel, why would we re-engage? If whatever we try and do, all cards are off the table, you can hit the country when you like, then you can tell us it was our fault that we brought it on ourselves, then you can tell us you have to come back to the negotiating table. There does really seem a sense that the West has not learnt much from this. And I'm concerned that the goal, of course, of stopping Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, and potentially the other issue, of course, is making Iranian people feel that they have allies in the West, right? The number of Iranians I spoke to on the ground throughout this war who said, why is this happening to us? Do they not understand that the regime have their own bunkers? We're the ones being killed. We're the ones running from our home. We've been brutalized by our own government for decades. Now we're being brutalized by these people who say they're our friends and want democracy for us. There is a real danger that any goodwill, certainly that America, that the West, and a little bit of goodwill that Israel had amongst some anti-regime Iranians has really been killed by this war.
I would say, just before moving on, that I think it's worth mentioning that Iran has posed a significant threat regionally through its proxy network. Its very key pillar of its security doctrine has been the idea of forward defense, and so carrying out or making vulnerable Arab capitals and lands and peoples as a way of deterring direct attacks on the Iranian homeland, I think has been well established.
I absolutely agree, and I, of course,
objectively
lived in Lebanon and Iraq and
yes,
covered those militias for many years. But what I mean is the way that it was phrased was to the world, not to the region. In the end, the majority of the West does not care about civilians in the Middle East, right? What they care about is an international threat. And the reality right now is that Iran is sort of feeling, and many Iranians are feeling, that they are being treated as though they are the worst threat in the world, when in fact they're just civilians, trying to survive, and they don't feel that they have had much kind of moral support in terms of that, and people have turned their faces away from what they've suffered once again.
Well, elsewhere in the Middle East, meanwhile, Iran's recently briskly reduced influence could be reduced still further. Israel's Foreign Minister Gideon Saar has mused out loud that the Abraham Accords, which normalised relations between Israel and several Arab states in 2020 to 2021, could be expanded to include Lebanon and Syria. In the former, Iran's proxy Hezbollah has been substantially decapitated. In the latter, Iran's former puppet Bashar al-Assad has been chased into exile. Israel has made clear, however, that it does not regard the Golan Heights, the plateau seized from Syria during the Six-Day War of 1967, as a bargaining chip. Layla, first of all, how tough a sell would this be to Lebanese and Syrian publics?
Well, I'm actually going to separate those two out, which I might not have said before. Lebanon, it's an absolute no-go. I mean, it would have been an absolute no-go before last year's war. And then, of course, Israel once again struck, the Lebanese, more than 20% of the population displaced from their homes, many of them still displaced from their homes, 3,000 people killed, most of them outside of the Hezbollah commanders who were killed, civilians. The south completely flattened and destroyed. Still, I mean, just yesterday, Israel launched lots more strikes on the south of Lebanon, and it started on Beirut a couple of weeks again. There's no sense in which there's a movement towards any kind of negotiation when they are still at war. Israel simply violates the ceasefire regularly and people ignore it. So for Lebanese, Israel is absolutely the enemy, and this would be a no-go. Syria is a very different story. Right from the start, when Ahmed al-Sharaa came in as the new president, he has been saying, he's been making noises about not necessarily wanting Israel to be their best friend and trading partner, but definitely about opening up negotiations there, definitely about, trying to reduce tensions. Even after Israel spread, beyond the Golan Heights, it's taken territory in Kenatra, it's constantly firing on Syrian troops, on Syrian civilians. Still, the tone has been very, very moderate. We are open to negotiations. We are open to, trying to keep some sort of dialogue going. And of course, Sharaa right now is extremely friendly towards the West, because we saw this incredible move a few weeks ago, thanks to MBS in Saudi Arabia, that Trump turned around and said, we're going to lift sanctions, we want to give Syria a chance. So of course, anything to do with the Abraham Accords, which are, many would say, an absolute non-starter, but Trump's great triumph thus far in his mind that he wants to continue expanding. I think certainly, a lot of the new Syrian government would be very on board with that. That's not to say that Syrian civilians would be, and they have to be incredibly careful in how they propose that, right? There is a big difference between saying Israel's our friend and we agree with their aims in the region, and saying we are going to make sort of, ties, both trade and negotiation-wise, to try and reduce tensions and reduce violence. That I really think could be a way forward, actually. And there isn't quite the same level of hatred and fear amongst all people in Syria towards Israel as there is in Lebanon.
But as Layla correctly points out, since the fall of Assad, Israel not only stepped up airstrikes on Syria, attempting to, I think, demolish what remained of its military capacity, but did help itself to a couple more chunks of territory beyond the Golan Heights. Is it possible that the reason Israel was doing that is that if they won't trade the Golan Heights for normalization with Syria, they might, and Syrians may well argue that this isn't much of a concession, we'll give you back the stuff we just took?
Yes, I mean, it's a bargaining posture, certainly. One of the reasons from an air dominance point of view that Syria has been so significant for Israel since the fall of Assad was the option to have Syrian airspace open to Israel to conduct strikes against Iran. There is, of course, the standoff between Israel and Turkey over dominance across parts of Syria, and there was deconfliction talks ongoing. So that's another potential flashpoint, although, again, more positive signals coming out on that topic in the past few weeks. I think from Damascus's point of view, from the interim government's point of view, conceding that the Golan Heights is going to be handed over to Israel is a no-go. I think this would be absolutely disastrous for the government in Damascus. And this is a country that is still plagued by the specter of terrorism linked to Daesh or Islamic State, and other pockets of sectarian violence, potentially. So to add to the mix the possibility of handing over key territory to Israel would be a recipe for disaster for Damascus.
Is there not a possible construct of a sort of ambiguity around that, i.e. Syria sort of says, yeah, it's ours, we claim it, we demand it back, etc., officially, but recognises that, no, obviously that's never going to happen.
And that would be the pragmatic, the sensible approach to take. And Shara has proven to be a man of great sensibilities and reason since taking over after Assad fled into exile, as you said. And Syria has been absolutely crippled by over 15 years of civil war and then decades of the dynastical sort of Assad father-son sort of terrorizing state before that. And so this is a country that is deeply in need of normalization with its neighbors, of economic opportunity, of meaningful sanctions relief and recovery. And so I think steps might be taken in the direction of normalization with Israel within the framework of a broader regional sort of peace architecture. And there are ways in which this can be framed without going so far as to say that Syria is the next signatory to the Abraham Accord architecture, which I find to be far-fetched. But again, this is the art of diplomacy and statesmanship, is to find these kinds of scope for flexibility, retain that scope for flexibility to find a solution that would be in the interest of the Syrian people. And again, bearing in mind, Syria is different than Lebanon because of, well, first of all, the experience that the Syrians had with Tehran over the course of the civil war, and the role that Iran played in violently propping up the Assad regime at the expense of civilian lives. And so a lot is at stake in the future of Syria in terms of stability.
Just a final quick one on this, Layla, and I do realise there's probably an extremely long answer to this question, but there's traditionally been a thing among a lot of the Middle Eastern Arab countries which have held out against recognising Israel that this won't happen until or unless there's a two-state solution, a resolution, settlement in Palestine, etc. The Abraham Accords seem to suggest that mattered less to the Arab nations than maybe it did 20 or 30 years ago. Would it still be a thing for Lebanon or Syria, or has everyone sort of realised at this point that this is looking like a bit of a lost cause and it doesn't profit us to ally ourselves with it?
Well, I mean, there's a huge change happening in the region right now. We're kind of in this strange place where, on the one hand, you had a lot of colonization happening with Israel, and then on the other hand, we've had not just the worst war, but the worst multi-part war that we've had in the region in decades suddenly emerged. So we've got two very extreme positions, right? There are multiple things here. I mean, the Palestinians have always, very sadly, been a cause rather than a realistic support and hope for people in the region, right? They've more been a kind of standard to bear. Now there's a much more realistic thing happening. If people are going to be forcibly displaced, where are they going to go? And many countries don't want to take them. And then on the other hand, you've got Iran, where people have different feelings depending on, which is quite often to do with how much they hate Israel. So, it's interesting what Burcu was saying there. The vast majority of Syrians, what they were saying during this war is, the two people I hate the most are fighting each other. I hope they obliterate each other. That's a really good example. I mean, it's not just that Iran propped up the Assad regime. It's that literally they funded Hezbollah to go in and perpetrate the most horrifying atrocities against Syrian civilians. And many Syrians will say to you, oh, now you care about Iran because they might have a bomb that can reach the West, but you certainly didn't care in all the years they were doing that to us. You certainly didn't send in an air force to stop them. And so I think, all of those kind of internal regional issues, different countries are starting to take different stances. And they do need to find some sort of unity on it. And the other interesting thing we're seeing is that, regional leaders who people in the Middle East have been begging for a decade are coming to the fore. Qatar, the role Qatar has played in the last 2 years, they have become the grown-up of the region, doing the lion's share of the negotiation with Palestine, doing the lion's share of the negotiation during this Iran-Israel deal. Then you've got Egypt trying to step forward as well. Saudi Arabia, obviously, becoming a big leader here. If they actually can become united on what they feel about each of these issues and what they want to push for, the likelihood is that Arab people will rally around them because they want some regional figurehead that they currently don't have.
Well, to the United States, the Senate of which will today debate the budget bill endorsed by President Donald Trump and which is genuinely called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or OBBBA. Almost interestingly, however, OBBBA does not enjoy the unanimous support of Republican senators. Veteran Libertarian Rand Paul of Kentucky is a likely nay, as is Tom Tillis of North Carolina. Senator Tillis, who is not seeking re-election and can therefore say what he thinks, has parted with a lament for a lost age of bipartisan cooperation, saying that independent thinkers were now an endangered species in Washington, D.C. He could probably have done without the qualifier independent. Senator Tillis, Birtue, says this is why he is quitting, that there are no more grown-ups, that everything is now a partisan bun fight. Do we think that's likely, or do we think he has just been reading his polls?
It's probably a bit of both, although I would lean towards the latter. It's a low risk, high reward type of statement to make, and I think you will be recognized for it in terms of the merit of standing up to power, or seeking accountability, or speaking truth to power. In that sense, yes, it's frustrating to see the lack of sort of independent critical thinking, I suppose. And the United States is not. That's the subject now, but it's not the only. It's not the only great state. We're particularly in a moment of uncertainty and fragility across many parts of Europe and elsewhere as well, when it comes to the absence of critical thinking and debating, contesting ideas that appear to have taken sort of hold of the public imagination. And the high level of politicization and the polarization, I think, this has really stuck with us, especially in this sort of age of the disinformation.
I mean, it is, Layla, more than 70 years, so legend has it, that Adlai Stevenson, who was then the Democratic nominee for president, was told by one person he met that he would have the vote of every thinking American, and replied, "That's no good, I need a majority." As the person who has most recently been there, did it strike you that tribal partisanship was any better or worse than previously in American history?
The tribal partisanship is, something approaching a war-type level at this point. I mean, the feeling of tension and the fact that the way that has spread to the people as well. This is really no longer political. It's everybody has something to say and is also absolutely terrified. And I had a kind of interesting move across the East Coast. I was in New York. I was in New York for the Emmys, in a room full of people, really dedicated to foreign news and the free press. Mm-hmm. And there were multiple statements being made about, the Trump government's kind of attempts to crack down on that and crack down on the free press. And then I went across to DC, where obviously the tensions are so incredibly high, and you've got all of this stuff moving through the various houses, and people really, really tense about violence on the streets. And then just less than 100 miles down the road, I went to rural Virginia, where you truly have the unthinking Trump voter in a really practical sense, as was being explained to me by people. They were saying, look, every single person, everywhere it says farmers for Trump. But in 3 weeks, all those farmers will need their crops picked. Mm-hmm. And currently, there are bounty hunters driving around Virginia because there is a bounty on every tip-off for an immigrant. Many of them who do have their papers and are completely legal. So not only are they being rounded up and sent to potentially horrific conditions, but they're also hiding inside, right? People aren't sending their kids to school. People aren't driving to their jobs. So even where there are people who will come and do these jobs, they're not going to come out. So suddenly all the crops are going to start rotting on the vine. Whose fault is that going to be? Trump has saved us. Actually, the practicalities of that are very different. We were talking about some, the Medicaid changes in this bill, and one of my friends out there was saying this will be war. I mean, taking, these basic levels of care away from people who already are so poor, where children are not being fed, where, people feel that it's an actual war for the future of their country. We had a report yesterday where people are getting packets of medicine in from China and grinding their medicines together on their kitchen tables for things like diabetes, things like their insulin, because they can't get it through government funding anymore, and they're terrified that will be cut out altogether. So there really is a sense which I theoretically understood from the outside, but having not been back to the States for an extended period since the inauguration, really feels incredibly visceral. People are very careful what they say. People look at each other as to whether or not they're a friend or an enemy. Political conversations either are extremely stilted because people are afraid, or become incredibly violent and emotional when they do get into them. There is a sense that this country is sort of being torn apart at the seams, and people are taking a lot more interest, actually, in what their governors are doing, specifically, for their own good, because they now feel someone needs to protect them. And so it's been such a wave of change and overhaul, much of it illegal, that people feel they don't know what side to battle on.
Final quick thought on this one, Birchu. Would it have made much difference? Would it have been some sort of step in a direction of conciliation if President Trump had turned up at the funeral of Melissa Hortman and her husband, she, of course, being the Minnesota state lawmaker who was recently assassinated?
Yes, I think so. I mean, the answer to that is a clear yes. I think there is so little room for sort of cross-party or bipartisan compassion or sort of shows of empathy. I think this would have been one. But this high level of polarization, of suspicion and skepticism about the other, really, and it's the specter of the other that now permeates the public landscape in America. And just listening to you there, Layla, about your recent visit, I mean, it sounds like so much of the environment in many of these Middle Eastern countries that we talk about as well, in terms of suspicion of the other, and are we being listened to, and will I be reported on? And it's very strange now. It's very difficult to come to terms with what has happened in the United States, and I grew up there, and and it's still you're processing this on a daily basis.
And just lastly on what you were saying, really importantly there, by not going, he said, I'm not a president for everyone. I didn't agree with them. He said, I'm not going to that. Biden showed up. Biden hugged every family member. Biden held his silence for them and for their dog. Trump said, I'm not going to that. They're not my supporters. And that in itself is the statement, right? He's not a leader for the whole country.
Well, to Lebanon now, which, despite what we will refer to as everything, is apparently experiencing something of an uptick in tourism, with arrivals up 10% year on year in May. Granted, this may be off a low base, like if 10 people went last year, 11 this year would be a 10% rise. But as a general editorial observation from the presenter's chair, more people should visit Lebanon, as it is an absolutely splendid place in most respects other than its governance and driving. Layla, this is a country you know well, obviously. Would you recommend taking a city break in Beirut right now?
I would recommend everyone immediately get on the plane to Lebanon.
Good
truly
answer.
One of the most spectacular countries in the world. I, of course, lived there for many years, love it very deeply, plan to go again very soon. This is the spirit of the Lebanese, right? I mean, it's what they do. They did it through COVID. The whole idea is that all the Lebanese expats from abroad, they come back every Christmas and every summer. That's how the country makes so much of its money. Everyone's desperate to be there. It's such a fun environment, such a beautiful environment. And there is a real sense of fighting this year, of everyone going back, and everyone sending messages around saying, go back, support the country, spend your money. There's a wonderful kind of Lebanese meme culture online, which always exists, and particularly now because MEA, the national carrier, is the only carrier that flies direct and they, of course, became heroes during the war last year because they continue to fly through the war, through Israeli bombs, get people in and out of the country. So they've all become heroes. But there's this fantastic meme culture of people, saying that things like watching the airspace every night, waiting to see whether or not my flight to Lebanon will still go ahead. And there was a wonderful one this morning of a woman in an incredible outfit, carrying 2 bin bags, presumably full of clothes, walking through a sort of cool guys walk away from explosions environment in the background, saying, me still getting on my plane to Beirut because I've spent $1,800 on my ticket. And that really is the feeling. So certainly all the Lebanese will go. I think a lot of other people who love Lebanon will go as well, and I would encourage everyone to do so. There is no other place in the world that fights through adversity with joy and love for their environment like Lebanon and the Lebanese.
Entirely correct answer. We did want to broaden this out a bit to sort of any other niche suggestions you may both have. I'll ask you for one each. Other than Beirut, obviously. Birchu, you first. Somewhere in the Middle East that you would recommend people who were curious go to?
I'm going to be slightly controversial, and this is not for the lighthearted. Well, maybe it's changed a lot, but I'm going to say Baghdad. I think Iraq has gone through a very interesting period of stability, of economic growth, and development. And it is a moment of optimism, which was almost derailed in quite a violent way last week if Iraq had been dragged into the conflict between Iran and Israel. But I will say Baghdad is very, very much worth seeing for historical reasons and to witness the evolution of this great city since the 2003 war. And
see, I would, as someone who hasn't been there since the 2003 war, I would be absolutely into that. I'd be very curious to go back to Baghdad. Layla, other than Beirut or indeed Baghdad, where would you pick?
Well, Baghdad, of course, is my other great love, and I moved there after Beirut, and I would chime in with that. Absolutely, it's an incredible place, really on the up, and a very positive time to go. I would say Damascus, partly because you can go now, and actually, as part of your trip, go along to Beirut and then take a quick drive over the border to Damascus.
How quick is that drive, though, really?
Very quick
because
now.
My recollections of that land border are that it is an absolute circus.
Well, if you're a journalist, Masna is an absolute circus. But if you're a tourist, they're making it extremely easy. Not with the rest of the country right now. Tensions are very high, but Damascus isn't. And I very much hope things continue to improve. But there is a strong sense that the government is starting to crack down. And my strong advice would be go to Damascus right now while it feels open and joyful and everyone is still celebrating. I hope things continue to improve. God knows the Syrian people deserve it, but I suspect there might be a little bit of a crackdown on movement coming, which already has come in the rest of the country. So I would say take your chance while you can. Go and see these incredible people, eat the incredible food, see the incredible art, spend as much money as you can, help them all reconstruct their businesses, and you will have the most glorious time.
Layla Milana Allen and Birchu Ershalek, thank you both for joining us. Finally on today's show, and by way of a sort of coda or callback to our top item, the recent strikes on Iran by Israel and the US were very far from the first attempt by external players to direct events inside Iran. In one of modern history's more resonant lessons in unintended consequences, in 1953, the US and the UK connived to overthrow Iran's democratic government, ushering in the miserable repression of the Shah and the miserable repression of the Ayatollahs. Nevertheless, efforts to subvert or disrupt rival nations are a continuing theme of history, considered in a new book called A Measure Short of War, A Brief History of Great Power Subversion by William C. Woolforth and Jill Kastner. I spoke to Jill earlier and began by asking for a definition of subversion and an example from the present day which might sum up what it means.
Well, the thing that sparked the research of this book was the Russian meddling in the U.S. presidential election in 2016. So subversion, we decided that we needed to come up with a definition because it's a sloppy term. It's often inelegantly applied, and it's bandied about, and it just tends to lose its meaning if you don't nail it down. So we decided that subversion is hostile, unwanted action on the territory of a rival with the intention of either weakening the rival or changing its foreign policy somehow. And if you break that down, it helps to think about it that way because the action has to be hostile. So if you've got covert action to prop up a government, that's not subversion. And it's got to seek effects. So espionage is not subversion. And often in broader worlds, people confuse these terms. And so for us to get a really clean definition was very important. There's a lot of really wonderful scholarship now about election meddling and covert action and all these different things which are tools of subversion. But what we wanted to do was bring them all together and look at subversion as a tool of statecraft, to sort of give it a new reputation, to elevate it, to make it kind of on par with diplomacy and balancing and war, because it is a thing that states use for rational purposes. And if we look at it that way, then we can think about it more calmly, and we can have a better chance of defending ourselves against it.
Because as your book makes clear, it is not a new idea, subversion. This has been going along for at least as long as diplomacy, espionage and warfare have been going along. But I was interested in the chapters where you talk about subversion in antiquity, where obviously they didn't have the option of setting up fake Facebook accounts. So how difficult or easy was it if you wanted to subvert Sparta or Rome or Persia or Greece?
Well, in some ways it was easier, because those city-states in the ancient classical world, in classical Greece, were very porous. So if you look at industrialized nations now, they're pretty tough targets. They've got good intelligence bureaucracies, and they've got good law enforcement, communications, patriotism, all these things that make it difficult for an adversary to subvert if it's a great power, if it's a big country. In the ancient world, there are a couple of things. One is that warfare was almost constant. It was like every summer you went to war. And that meant that the levels of hostility that encouraged subversive behavior were kind of always there. And it also had subversive action baked into the way that politics were undertaken at the time. So, one of the punishments for a naughty citizen would be exile. So these exiled citizens often liked to go back and try and overthrow the government of the city from which they'd been banished. And they would do that in cahoots with one of the great powers of the time, which would be Athens or Sparta or Persia. So there was a lot of that going on, and it was easy to kind of sneak into the city walls and assassinate somebody and bribe someone else. It was just a lot easier then. The other thing that was interesting about the ancient world is that there was a position of the proxenos, and this would be an affluent, influential statesman who would be the representative of another city-state within the city. So, for instance, you could be a wealthy citizen of Athens, and you could be the proxenos of Sparta, and that meant that you looked after Sparta's interests in Athens. And they did this, among all the little states. But not only were they doing that, there's a lot of evidence that shows they were involved in intelligence gathering and in clandestine activities like bribery and coups and assassination. So it was a real rough and tumble, a lot more subversion in that day that was decisive than what we see now.
I mean, there are obviously many advantages of subversion as a tool of hostile statecraft. It is certainly, compared to open warfare, much, much cheaper. It is relatively deniable. But I'm also wondering, does it have, or are there examples of it having one of the disadvantages of open warfare, which is that, as anybody who's ever been to war will wearily confirm, once you start one, you only have really limited input into where it goes. These things do have a means of taking on a life of their own. Is that a hazard with subversion as well?
Yes, it is, particularly with the more kinetic end of the spectrum. So if you're doing propaganda or disinformation, you can control that a little bit more, and also the effects of that are not as deadly or as physical. And if you imagine it as a spectrum going towards something that's more violent, so sabotage or throwing in some paramilitary guys or assassination, something like that, that's really hard to reverse. And once you've got those people on the ground, they're really hard to control. So the principal agent problem is tricky when you've got agents on the ground and you're a long way away and you're trying to keep it secret. The covertness is really important for that.
I mean, is there an inbuilt disadvantage for some countries when they are being subverted? We started out by talking about the example of Russia's messing in the 2016 presidential election in the United States. Is it easier for a country like Russia, i.e. authoritarian, censored, etc., to run subversion operations in a country like the United States than it is for the United States to do similar in Russia?
Yes, the answer is yes. Autocracy like Russia doesn't have to worry about elections every 4 or 5 years, doesn't have to worry about public opinion, doesn't have the same sort of constraints, and can direct a budget to whatever it wants. And so, yes, there's an advantage to that. That doesn't mean that they'll be more successful, though. It's easier for them to perpetrate the activity, but there's no guarantee that it'll have the effects. And what we saw with 2016 and throughout the last several centuries is that subversion among great powers tends to be self-limiting because of the the strength of those powers because of the nature of needing trust or cooperation with another power on some issue completely unrelated to the issue of contention between the two of them. And so for an autocracy, yes, it's easier to launch, but democracies are surprisingly robust. And we've seen that all the way along in the 30s, for instance, when the Comintern was active all over the place and people were worried about Soviet subversion. You had the Great Depression. You had new technology in the form of the radio. So there were lots of ingredients that would have made you think that the democracies would have given in and that subversion would have been much more successful. But it wasn't really. People are patriotic. They don't like it when someone's messing around in their country. So that's very powerful.
And just finally, how do you see it evolving? Do you, for example, share the concern, which I know is aired in some quarters, that a platform like TikTok is essentially a vast Trojan horse launched by the Chinese Communist Party?
Yes, it is. I mean, but it's like everything else. You know, technology is a double-edged sword. The things that are used to subvert can also be used to defend. And it all comes down to what individuals do. And so that's down to individual responsibility and education and pulling your eyeballs up off of your iPhone and getting off of TikTok and thinking about who's benefiting from what you're being exposed to and where that's going. So, you know, one reason for investigating subversion the way that we have is to think of better ways to fight back against it. And so one of those ways is to have a sort of a gimlet eye on things like TikTok, not ban them necessarily, but be very aware of what the repercussions can be.
That was Jill Kastner speaking to me earlier. A Measure Short of War, A Brief History of Great Power Subversion by William C. Woolforth and Jill Kastner is available now. That is all for this edition of The Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Birchu Öscherlich and Leila Molana Allen. Today's show was produced by Chris Chermak and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Flynn Simons. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.